She left a positive pregnancy test on the counter, then admitted she lied about being infertile and stopped birth control without telling me. Now her family says I'm the villain. I'll never forget the moment I walked into the bathroom and saw that pregnancy test. At first, I froze. Was this a prank? My fiancée, Sarah, had told me years ago that she was infertile. It was one of the first serious conversations we'd had in our relationship. I told her I didn't want kids, and she said it wouldn't be an issue because she physically couldn't have them. I accepted that without question, and we moved forward together. 4 years later, here we are, engaged, planning our future. And now, this? The test sat there, like it was mocking me. My first thought was that maybe it wasn't hers. Maybe she was holding on to it for a friend. But when I showed it to her, her face crumpled. That's when she told me the truth. She wasn't infertile. She never was. Her exact words are burned into my memory. I lied because I didn't want you to leave me. Apparently, she thought if I knew she could have kids, I'd walk away since I'd made it clear early on that fatherhood wasn't in my plans. She'd carried that lie for years. And then came the part that shattered me. I stopped taking birth control a few months ago. I wanted to see if you'd change your mind if it just happened. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She had made a deliberate choice to take that decision, my decision, away from me. I felt like the ground beneath me had crumbled. The betrayal was so deep it physically hurt. Her reasoning. I love you. I wanted us to have a deeper connection, and I thought this would make us stronger. Stronger? She had lied to me for years and manipulated me into fatherhood, something I had explicitly said I didn't want. How could we possibly be stronger after this? I told her I needed space to think, but she kept pushing. She didn't seem to grasp the magnitude of what she'd done. Finally, I told her to stay with her sister for a while. I needed to process everything, the lie, the manipulation, and the fact that I was now going to be a father against my will. Her response? She accused me of abandoning her and our unborn child. Her family has joined in too, bombarding me with texts and calls, calling me a monster, a deadbeat dad, and worse. It's like no one understands why I'm upset. I never wanted kids. I never signed up for this. But at the same time, I can't ignore the fact that there's a child involved now. I feel trapped, like my life has been hijacked. Every time I try to think through my options, I feel the weight of her deception crushing me. It's not just the pregnancy, it's the years of lies. How can I trust her again after this? How can I move forward with someone who thought it was okay to manipulate me into such a massive life change? At the same time, I don't know how to walk away from my child, even if I never wanted to be a parent. I keep going over it in my head, trying to figure out if I'm overreacting, like Sarah says. Am I being cruel for asking for space? Or am I justified in feeling like my entire life has been turned upside down? Update 1. After a few days of silence, Sarah's sister showed up at my door. I wasn't expecting it, and honestly, I was still mentally untangling everything when I saw her standing there. She's got this no-nonsense energy that's always intimidated me a little, but at that moment, it was dialed up to 11. She didn't even wait for me to invite her in. She just pushed past me and said, "We need to talk." I wasn't in the mood for any more lectures, but before I could say anything, she launched into it. "She's my sister, and I love her, but you have every right to be upset." That caught me off guard. I'd been bracing myself for another round of guilt-tripping and insults. Instead, she sat down at my kitchen table, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "I'm not here to take her side. I just want to understand what you're planning to do, because this isn't just about you two anymore." She wasn't wrong. There was a baby in the mix now, a kid I didn't ask for, but was still my responsibility. I told her that I hadn't decided anything yet, that I was still trying to wrap my head around the fact that Sarah had lied to me for years and then manipulated me into becoming a dad. I laid it all out, sparing no detail, and by the time I was done, she looked conflicted. "I get it," she said finally. "What she did was wrong. I'm not going to argue with you on that. But you need to figure out what kind of father you want to be, because whether you like it or not, you are one now. That hit harder than I expected. I'd spent so much time focusing on how angry I was at Sarah that I hadn't really thought about the baby. It wasn't their fault that this happened. They didn't ask to be dragged into this mess. Her sister stayed for another hour, mostly listening while I vented. When she left, she said something that stuck with me. Sarah's got issues, but she does love you. She just doesn't know how to handle her own insecurities. It was almost enough to make me feel sorry for her. Almost. The next day, I decided to meet up with one of my closest friends, Mark. He's one of those brutally honest types who will call me out when I'm being an idiot, so I figured he'd have some perspective. I hadn't told him about the pregnancy yet, so when I dropped that bombshell, he just stared at me for a solid minute before saying, "Dude, what the actual hell?" I gave him the rundown, and his reaction was exactly what I expected. Pure outrage. He was furious on my behalf, calling Sarah's actions next-level manipulative and saying I should lawyer up immediately. But then, halfway through his rant, he stopped and said, "Okay, but what do you want to do about the kid?" And there it was again. The kid. No matter how angry I was at Sarah, the baby was still there, waiting to be dealt with. I told Mark that I didn't know. I wasn't sure if I could co-parent with someone I couldn't trust, but I also couldn't imagine walking away entirely. He nodded, like that made sense, and said, "Look, whatever you decide, you need to protect yourself first. Talk to a lawyer, figure out your rights, and go from there. Don't let her guilt trip you into anything." That night, I sat down and tried to map out my next steps. The first thing on my list was finding a therapist. I knew I needed help unpacking everything that had happened and figuring out how to move forward. The second thing was looking into legal advice. I wasn't planning to take Sarah to court, but I wanted to know what my options were, just in case. The third thing was reaching out to Sarah. As much as I wanted to stay mad at her forever, I knew we needed to talk. Avoiding her wasn't going to solve anything, and we couldn't keep dragging her sister into the middle of this mess. When I called her, she picked up immediately. Her voice was shaky, like she'd been crying, but she sounded relieved to hear from me. "Thank you for calling," she said, before I even had a chance to speak. "I've been going crazy, not knowing what you're thinking." I told her we needed to meet in person, somewhere neutral, to talk about everything. She agreed right away, and we set up a time to meet at a coffee shop near her sister's house. The conversation started off tense. She apologized again for lying to me about her infertility, but this time, she didn't try to justify it. She admitted that she'd acted out of fear and insecurity, and that it was a horrible thing to do. She said she'd been terrified that I would leave her if I knew she could have kids, and that when we got engaged, she started feeling like time was running out to change my mind about fatherhood. "I should have talked to you," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I should have trusted you to love me, even if we didn't agree on this one thing. But I was scared, and I made a terrible mistake." I didn't let her off the hook. I told her that what she'd done wasn't just a mistake, it was a betrayal. She had taken away my ability to make an informed decision about my own life, and that wasn't something I could just forgive overnight. But as much as I wanted to stay angry, I couldn't ignore the fact that she was genuinely remorseful. She wasn't trying to manipulate me this time. She was just a scared, flawed person who had made a terrible choice. By the end of the conversation, we agreed to take things one step at a time. For now, that means coexisting as civilly as possible and focusing on the baby. Whether or not we can salvage our relationship is still up in the air, but at least we're talking. I'm still not sure where this leaves us, but I feel a little more grounded now. I've got a therapist lined up, a lawyer on standby, and a plan to take this one day at a time. It's not perfect, but it's a start. Update 2. It's been a few months since everything happened, and honestly, my life has been a whirlwind. I've tried to piece together some kind of normalcy, but it hasn't been easy. I promised to share how things turned out, so here's the final chapter of this saga. After my last post, Sarah and I focused on the pregnancy, but we kept things strictly about the baby. I was civil, she was apologetic, and we both tried to avoid rehashing the betrayal because it didn't lead anywhere productive. Therapy was a game changer for me. My therapist helped me process the anger and resentment, not just toward Sarah, but toward the situation as a whole. I came to terms with something crucial. While I didn't choose to be a father, I couldn't punish the baby for Sarah's decisions. That mindset shift helped me approach things with more clarity. I got involved in the pregnancy, not because I forgave Sarah, but because I needed to prepare myself. We went to doctor's appointments together, attended birthing classes, awkward but necessary, and started discussing logistics like custody and finances. It wasn't exactly harmonious, but it was functional. About 2 months ago, Sarah gave birth to a healthy baby girl. I'll admit, the moment I saw her, something shifted in me. It's hard to explain, but holding her for the first time felt right. She didn't ask to be born into this mess, and she deserved love and stability, regardless of how she came into the world. That doesn't mean everything magically resolved itself, though. Sarah and I had to have some tough conversations in the weeks following the birth. Once the initial new parent haze lifted, I knew it was time to address the elephant in the room, our relationship. I told Sarah that while I respected her efforts to make amends, I couldn't see a path forward for us romantically. The trust we'd built over 4 years was gone, and I couldn't pretend otherwise. She cried, of course, she cried. But she didn't argue. She said she understood and that she was just grateful I was staying involved for our daughter's sake. We worked with a mediator to draft a custody agreement. I wanted to avoid a messy legal battle, and thankfully, Sarah was cooperative. We agreed on a shared custody arrangement. She has primary custody, but I have her several days a week. I also contribute financially, and we've started a joint savings account for our daughter's future. Co-parenting is weird. On one hand, it's rewarding to be there for my daughter and watch her grow. On the other hand, it's hard to navigate this new dynamic with Sarah. We've settled into a kind of business-like relationship where all our communication revolves around our daughter. It's not warm, but it works. I've had a lot of time to reflect on everything that happened. For a while, I was stuck in a loop of what-ifs. What if Sarah hadn't lied? What if I'd noticed the red flags earlier? What if I'd walked away entirely? But eventually, I realized that dwelling on the past wasn't helping anyone. Not me, not Sarah, and certainly not my daughter. Now, I'm focusing on building the best possible life for her. I've rearranged my work schedule to accommodate my custody days, and I'm making sure she has a loving, stable environment whenever she's with me. It's not the life I envisioned for myself, but it's a life I'm learning to embrace. As for Sarah, she's been trying to grow from this experience. She's still in therapy and has been working on her trust and communication issues. We're not friends, and I don't think we ever will be, but I can see that she's making an effort. I'll give her credit for that. There's one thing I didn't expect: how much my perspective on fatherhood has changed. I went into this whole situation feeling trapped, manipulated, and resentful. But now, I can't imagine my life without my daughter. She's this tiny, curious, incredible little human who lights up every room she's in. Being her dad is the hardest thing I've ever done, but it's also the most rewarding. To anyone wondering if I regret how things turned out, it's complicated. Do I wish Sarah had been honest from the start? Absolutely. Do I wish I'd had the chance to decide for myself whether or not to become a father? Of course. But do I regret my daughter? Not for a second. This isn't the happy ending I would have chosen, but it's the one I've got. And honestly, it's not so bad.